Welcome to meeting number 60 of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. All witnesses have carried out the connection tests required before the meeting.
To ask your pardon, please, I am not going to name every witness by name in order to save some time due to the vote we have. So I would like to start inviting witnesses. Yes.
Can I that we forego our committee business meeting today and make sure that we've got, because we have such a limited amount of time, and perhaps, I don't know how many witnesses we have, but perhaps we could truncate slightly the opening statements as well so that we can get to some Q&A.
Thank you. That's exactly what I decided. Instead of 5 minutes, I'm giving 3 minutes. And for the question period, instead of 7 minutes, I'm giving 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Lake. So, yes, please.
And might I suggest that to save time, we could do a little bit of back and forth informally on the list of the potential awardees, and maybe see if we can come to a consensus just by talking in the chamber or something. Okay.
So, the floor for the clerk, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to inform members of...
Your attention, please.
I just wanted to inform members of upcoming logistical deadlines for the Human Rights Defenders Awards. Currently, they're scheduled to be presented to the candidates selected by the subcommittee on December 10th. Given the fact that that date is approaching, it would be appreciated to have some clarity on not only the names of the candidates, but the format that that the subcommittee would like to hold the event towards. Last year, it was conducted quite similar to a standard subcommittee meeting. The members appeared, or the recipients appeared, gave statements, and were congratulated, much like a similar meeting. Before the pandemic, additional commemorative measures were put in place. Given that the date is approaching, some direction on the committee's decision on how elaborate the event should be would be much appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Leclerc. Yes, Anita.
Might I suggest that, like we did the first couple of times, that we approach the speaker and see if the speaker would be willing to host a reception afterwards, for which he's done before, for the awardees. So we have our own meeting where they can speak, and then we retire to the speaker's chambers for a reception. No?
No. Okay, thank you. So I would like to invite Madame Charlotte Ann Malishweski to take the floor for 3 minutes, please. Madame Malishweski, the floor is yours for 3 minutes, please.
Bonjour, honorable membres. Je vous...
Honorable members.
Go ahead, Madame Malishweski.
Honorable members, thank you for having invited me to appear before the committee today. I'm speaking from Ottawa, the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, whose culture and presence is continuing to nourish this earth. At the Commission, we recognize that we need to reflect upon our colonial heritage and the systemic injustices that Indigenous peoples still have to face. We are committed to pursuing reconciliation with humility and openness. The Commission is delighted with your study. First of all, we'd like to express our support to the common recommendation, which will be presented by our panelist colleagues. We are involved in formulating a national framework for human rights.
The Commission plays a unique role in the UPR process. There are so many human rights issues in Canada requiring attention. So we have focused our advocacy during this UPR cycle on a cross-cutting issue that affects some of the most vulnerable people in this country. the condition of people deprived of their liberty. This is not just about people detained inside our prison system. It's also about people who are deprived of their liberty outside of that system. It's about migrant detainees, Black and First Nation children who are being removed from their homes and placed in care, elderly people confined to long-term care facilities, and people with disabilities who are institutionalized in communities across the country. While some oversight mechanisms do exist, there are overwhelming gaps. That's why we're calling for the immediate ratification of OPCAT, the United Nations optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and other forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Ratifying OPCAT would provide a powerful framework for ensuring there is meaningful oversight in all places where people are deprived of their liberty. We need only think back a couple years to the pandemic to understand how important this is in places like long-term care homes. And in prisons, ratifying OPCAT would pave the way for a more proactive approach to dealing with systemic human rights issues. Issues like the overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized prisoners, especially Indigenous women, the use of solitary confinement, the treatment of prisoners with mental health disabilities, the warehousing of older prisoners where alternatives would be more appropriate, and the safety of 2S LGBTQIA+ prisoners facing sexual coercion and violence. Il y a 8 ans, le gouvernement s'est engagé à ratifier l'OPCAT.
8 years ago, the government committed to ratify OPCAT. Since then, the Commission has been calling on Canada to follow through. Many of our colleagues here today have echoed this call, as did the 25 member states. During the UPR, ratifying OPCAT would be a significant step towards fulfilling Canada's human rights obligations and strengthening protections for all. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Madam.
Thank you, Ms. Maliszewski. I'd like to invite Ms. Michelle Biss.
Michelle Biss, s'il vous plaît. Vous avez la
5 minutes, 3 minutes, sorry.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address this committee. My name is Michelle Biss, and I'm the National Director of the National Right to Housing Network, a broad-based civil society network of organizations and individuals who work to ensure that the government's human rights commitments made under the National Housing Strategy Act are meaningfully realized. The NRHN has engaged in United Nations reviews, including the 2022 review by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, the 2023 Universal Periodic Review by the Human Rights Council, and the most recent 2024 review by the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We have had the opportunity to engage with the team at Heritage Canada and attend meetings like the Continuing Committee of Officials on Human Rights and meetings of the federal, provincial, and territorial ministers responsible for human rights. I have sat on the other side of Zoom calls and across in-person tables while government representatives read the same speaking notes that are conveyed in press releases, instead of meaningfully engaging on human rights accountability with civil society representatives and rights holders. In this meeting, I would most likely like to convey the deep sense of frustration across civil society organizations that Canada is not taking its human rights accountability mechanisms seriously and that there is no improvement since this committee wrote its 2010 report. I want to acknowledge the efforts of staff teams at Heritage who have created processes like the Director General Rights Group and the June CCOHR presentation of a civil society engagement strategy. The challenge is that despite what I believe are very good intentions by the staff at Heritage, they are under-resourced and civil society has not been meaningfully integrated into these meetings. I am increasingly hearing from civil society colleagues that human rights engagement meetings lack authentic human rights practices and feel like a waste of resources for organizations who already have limited capacity. I would like to amplify my colleagues' recommendations to call on federal, provincial, and territorial governments to implement and adopt a national framework for international human rights implementation. I also echo the call for further witnesses to be called from government and to rights holders with lived experience of human rights violations. As my colleagues will state, we cannot position ourselves as champions of human rights on the global stage if we do not lead by example at home. I am coming to you also with deep knowledge of Canada's first domestic implementation mechanism on an economic and social right through the National Housing Strategy Act, which has some
Can
strong...
you repeat out, please? Time is...
Yes, which has some strong proof points that I'm happy to share on meaningful engagement with rights holders that can create strong rights-based policy and outcomes.
Thank you, Madame Biss. Maintenant, j'aimerais inviter Monsieur...
I would like to invite Alex Neva, Adjunct Professor of International Human Rights Law at the University of Ottawa. You have the floor for 3 minutes. Professor Neve.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.
Subcommittee members. It is a pleasure to be here. People are often surprised to learn that Canada's record of engagement with the international human rights system is problematic. Canada has ratified just over 70% of the main UN human rights instruments. At the University of Ottawa, where I teach, that would be a B-, and none of the inter-American human rights treaties, which of course would be a failing grade. But more critically, there are significant shortcomings when it comes to meeting those obligations. That is clear from recommendations from numerous UN human rights bodies, experts, and processes, including the Universal Periodic Review over the years, pressing Canada to more effectively implement the country's human rights obligations. This is of concern on the home front because failure to meet those obligations means failure to address serious domestic human rights challenges. It is also of concern internationally because failing to comply with those obligations that we impress upon other governments undermines vital diplomatic efforts. The obstacles are many. First, the challenge of our federal system, with constitutional responsibility for particular human rights issues divided among federal, provincial, and territorial governments. Second, no clear political accountability for human rights. There is no Minister of Human Rights at any level of government in Canada. Third, reticence to recognize the equal legal standing of economic, social, and cultural rights. Fourth, positions adopted in court by government lawyers often downplay the applicability of international human rights law. Fifth, excessive secrecy, inadequate public reporting, and poor engagement processes with Indigenous peoples organizations and civil society groups. Six, failure of Parliament and legislative assemblies to monitor international human rights compliance across the country. Seventh, failure to recognize the role of municipal governments and Indigenous governments. And eighth, insufficient resourcing of the processes and bodies integral to upholding international human rights. After decades of inaction, in 2017, federal, provincial, and territorial governments met to consider international human rights implementation. They established the Forum of Ministers on Human Rights, which met for the first time last year, but has yet to live up to its potential. Speaking on behalf of all of us appearing before you today, we recommend that the federal government take the lead in working with provincial and territorial governments, Indigenous peoples, and civil society to develop a national framework for international human rights implementation as a priority for the next meeting of the Forum of Ministers. That framework should include clear public commitments to international human rights implementation from all federal, provincial, and territorial governments, adoption of federal, provincial, and territorial
Can you wrap it up, please? Time is up.
The obligations, improved consultation, an enhanced role for Parliament and legislatures, and increased resourcing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Neve. Maintenant, j'aimerais inviter Madame...
I would now invite Ms. Megan Doherty, Co-Director of Policy and Advocacy, Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights.
Please.
Thank you. Merci. I'm here today on behalf of Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. We have participated in all of Canada's universal periodic reviews, and I have also worked with more than 100 civil society organizations in more than 50 countries to support their engagement in the UPR process. I will focus my remarks today on the importance of civil society participation in these processes. At the outset, I would like to emphasize that human rights are not just a set of ideals to which countries should aspire. Human rights are legal obligations of states who have ratified international human rights treaties. Compliance with these legal obligations is reviewed through a variety of mechanisms, including the UPR, which are essential for civil society to be able to elevate neglected and stigmatized issues of concern. We participate in the UPR because it is an accessible and powerful mechanism for connecting the international human rights framework to the realities of people's lives. It is uniquely designed to be a collaborative and ongoing process which emphasizes building the capacity of rights holders to claim their rights and of duty bearers to meet their obligations. In other countries, this looks like assigning a federal ministry to be accountable for follow-up and implementation of UN human rights recommendations, providing multiple entry points for civil society to engage directly with decision makers throughout the process, and publishing midterm reports on implementation progress, among many other examples. In Canada, the UPR does not look like this. Civil society and rights holders are treated as passive recipients of technocratic information that is devoid of actual dialogue on the issues being considered. While different government human rights tables have been established, their program of work and outcomes, if any, are not publicly available, and there is no framework in which to operationalize the recommendations. Civil society organizations are invited to attend portions of these meetings and to give our opinions on which of the hundreds of recommendations should be implemented and how, often within 90 minutes or less. And then a box is ticked. This is not meaningful participation. It doesn't help the governments in their task before it, and it certainly doesn't help the people who are directly impacted by human rights violations. All of us are here today because we believe in human rights. We want Canada to be the champion of human rights it purports to be on the global stage, and we are ready to roll up our sleeves to do this important work. And we are asking all levels of government to do the same. We urgently need a national framework for human rights implementation that recognizes the critical role of civil society. There is no time to waste. Thank you.
Perfect timing. And maintenant, j'invite Madame Sheila.
I would invite Ms. Sheila Day, a chair of the Human Rights Committee at the Feminist Alliance for International Action.
Minutes, please.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
and thank you for the invitation to be here today. It is not acceptable that in 2024, Canada does not have a national mechanism to monitor compliance with its international human rights commitments and to ensure implementation of treaty body and UPR recommendations. Canada needs a framework of law, policy, and programs as described by Alex Neve to guide and ensure Canada's compliance with international human rights law, and Canada needs it urgently. The Feminist Alliance for International Action, which I represent today, was formed in 1997 with the specific goal of ensuring that the rights of women set out in international human rights treaty that Canada has ratified become real in the lives of women in Canada. We believe that these rights matter and that fulfilling them matters to the lives of women and to the health of the country. We need international human rights treaties in addition to the Charter and human rights codes because international human rights law fills many gaps. It provides a full and comprehensive set of human rights protections that our domestic legislation does not, including commitments to an adequate standard of living and to due diligence on the part of governments to protect women from male violence. Since 1997, FAFIA has participated in almost every review of Canada by treaty bodies and in the 4 cycles of the Universal Periodic Review. We have repeatedly urged our governments to develop mechanisms and procedures for implementing the recommendations that emerge from these reviews so that we can move forward, solve problems, improve lives, and repair harms. But we and our many human rights colleagues have not been successful in persuading Canada to create an effective domestic mechanism to support the implementation of recommendations and the fulfillment of rights. The importance of what happens after reviews is freshly before us, not just with the UPR recommendations, but also with recommendations from the CEDAW committee. A week ago, on October 29th, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women issued the concluding observations after its 10th review of Canada and Canada's compliance with the CEDAW Convention. This was a review marked by a high attendance of Indigenous women, of racialized women, and of young women. There are many recommendations from the CEDAW Committee that, if implemented, would make a marked difference to their lives. They have hopes. Prominent among its many strong
Would you please wrap it up, Madam? The time is up.
I will. Prominent among them is a repetition of a recommendation from the CEDAW Committee that they made in 2012 and 2016, create a mechanism, a national mechanism to report, follow up, and implement international recommendations. We need that recommendation implemented as a key element of Canada's response to UPR recommendations and to CEDAW recommendations in 2024.
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Day. Maintenant, j'invite Monsieur...
I would now invite Mr. Alexei White, a Systems Change Director of Matry. Please go ahead.
To the subcommittee for beginning this important study. I will focus my opening comments on how Canada's provinces and territories are effectively unaccountable for implementation of the UPR or their international human rights obligations more broadly. Here's a startling fact. All provinces and territories in Canada, except one, do not explicitly acknowledge the existence of their legal obligations under international human rights law. As the subcommittee well knows, human rights obligations are binding on subnational governments in states with federal systems, yet as far as I can find, only Quebec is willing to publicly acknowledge this fact in its policy statements. Its international policy states correctly that, quote, as a party to these texts, Quebec has a duty to enforce them within its borders and to report on compliance to the competent United Nations human rights bodies, end quote. Meanwhile, Alberta's government contends, wrongly, that it is not required to participate in the UPR or otherwise respect international human rights law. In a footnote to the FPT protocol for follow-up to recommendations for international human rights bodies, Alberta states it is, quote, not bound to report on international instruments or mechanisms to which it is not a party, end quote. As you can see, Canada's governments do not even recognize their human rights obligations, let alone work together to effectively implement them. Implementing the UPR also requires provinces and territories to have strong internal processes, structures, and mechanisms for human rights. Helpfully, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has studied countries around the world and documented several criteria for strong mechanisms. Here is how our provincial and territorial governments do against a few key criteria. First, mechanisms should have a formal mandate and political ownership. Unfortunately, our provinces and territories do not publish information about their specific processes and structures, and there is no political ownership in the form of a minister with clear responsibility for human rights implementation. Second, mechanisms should offer meaningful engagement with rights holders. Unfortunately, provinces and territories generally have no regular engagement processes of their own. Third, mechanisms should demonstrate accountability for a country's human rights commitments. Alas, no province or territory in Canada publishes meaningful implementation plans responding to recommendations received from the UPR or other UN processes. It is not hard to see why Canada received multiple UPR recommendations from other countries calling for improvements to our mechanisms for implementation. 14 years ago, this subcommittee said Canadians should be able to, quote, hold all orders of government accountable for their role in implementing Canada's international human rights obligations, end quote. Today, this most basic expectation remains unmet. I urge you to invite witnesses representing provincial and territorial governments to better understand just how opaque and ineffective human rights mechanisms are across the country. I also urge you to write a report examining progress on the subcommittee's 2010 recommendations, many of which remain unmet. And finally, I echo my fellow witnesses in calling on federal, provincial, and territorial governments to develop and adopt a national framework for international human rights implementation. As your predecessor said in 2010, failure to act in our own backyard is a threat to Canada's aspirations as a global human rights champion, and the world is noticing.
Thank you, Professor. Maintenant,
And now, I would invite Ms. Anjum Sultana, Director of Youth Leadership and Policy Advocacy.
Mr. Chair and esteemed members of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights, thank you for the invite for participating in your study on the implementation of Canada's Universal Periodic Review. My name is Anjum Sultana, and I'm the Director of Youth Leadership and Policy Advocacy at Plan International Canada, an international development and humanitarian charity focused on advancing children's rights and equality for girls globally. As a member of the Plan International Federation, we're committed to ensuring the realization of children's rights, gender equality, and inclusion through our participation in international human rights mechanisms such as the CRC, SDIR, and UPR. Furthermore, my testimony today is grounded in the work we do here in Canada to advance policy dialogue and girls' rights and youth leadership. Over the last 4 years, we've engaged over 300,000 young people in our programming and over 1.3 million people in Canada through our youth-focused public engagement initiatives. Children, young people, and future generations are vital to Canada's prosperity. They're not just the leaders of tomorrow, they're the leaders of today. Firstly, to ensure intergenerational fairness, Canada must take urgent action to enable the full realization of children's rights, equality for girls, and inclusion. This includes health, education, safety, protection, and adequate standards of living for all children, especially girls and young women, and all of their diversity. As noted in the 2022 CRC review and 2023 UPR, this must include developing a comprehensive law on children's rights at the federal level in line with the principles of the Convention, ensuring equal implementation across Canada. To that end, we're encouraged by the work of Senator Rosemary Moody and several children's rights agencies in developing Bill S-282, a national strategy for children and youth. Furthermore, as noted in UPR 2023, we encourage Canada to meet the internationally agreed target of 0.7% of gross national income towards official development assistance and to increase prioritization of children's rights in its international cooperation agreements. There are over 8 million children in Canada who are counting on our collective leadership and investment in their future. Let's do right by them. It will pay dividends not only in Canada, but around the world. Secondly, as noted by my colleagues, the federal government must work in partnership with provincial and territorial governments to develop and adopt a national framework for international human rights implementation. The framework must include several elements, such as the increased resourcing of and improved consultation with Indigenous peoples organizations and civil society organizations, including young people themselves and youth-led and youth-serving organizations. This echoes a key recommendation in Plan International Canada's Can Youth Pact, calling for standardized processes to ensure meaningful youth engagement. Until we are all equal, Canada must be a vocal champion in advancing human rights internationally.
Can you wrap it up, please? Time is
to
out.
Global health, to inequality, to our destinies are tied, locally and globally. For our diplomatic engagement to be meaningful and credible, it requires effective implementation of international human rights obligations here at home. Thank you.
Maintenant, I would like to invite Mr. Nishin Natwani, responsable de la stratégie Rainbow Railroad.
Responsible for strategy at Rainbow Railroad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you as well for the invitation to be here today. My name is Dr. Nishin Nathwani, and I am the head of strategy at Rainbow Railroad, which is an international organization dedicated to supporting at-risk LGBTQI+ individuals to escape state-sponsored violence and access pathways to safety. I'd like to start by recognizing Canada's ongoing commitment to implementing the recommendations from its most recent Universal Periodic Review, particularly those recommendations focused on protecting LGBTQI+ persons in forced displacement and supporting those who have been resettled to Canada. I'd like to name a couple of these recommendations. Canada has supported, for instance, recommendation 37.315 from Iceland, which advises developing strategies to address homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia and counter the rise of anti-gender movements. We observe daily in our own work at Rainbow Railroad how the growing global anti-gender movement is fueling new waves of LGBTQI+ forced displacement and is contributing to a worsening environment for LGBTQI+ refugees even after resettlement. I'd also like to mention Canada's support for recommendation 37.317 from the UK, which underscores the importance of collaborating with partners at all levels, including civil society, to address the root causes of violence against LGBTQI+ communities. In this respect, I think Global Affairs Canada's partnership with Rainbow Railroad to establish an international network of governments, civil society organizations, and refugees to advance protection and solutions for LGBTQI+ persons in forced displacement is a really positive step in the right direction. Now, while we recognize Canada's support for these recommendations, I'd also like to underscore that critical challenges remain. For instance, many LGBTQI+ asylum seekers face prolonged stays in transit countries where they frequently endure compounded persecution and marginalization from host governments, civil society, families, and even other migrants and asylum seekers. We urge Canada to expand funding opportunities and partnerships with Canadian and international civil society to reduce these risks in protracted displacement settings. We are also deeply concerned by Canada's recent announcement of a reduction in refugee resettlement slots for 2025. We join the Canadian Council for Refugees in urging the government to recommit to resettlement as a vital protection mechanism for those facing severe human rights violations, including many LGBTQI+ asylum seekers. On this point, I think it's essential to remember that the statistical majority of the world's asylum seekers are hosted in countries where LGBTQI+ identity, intimacy, association, or expression is criminalized to some degree. And for this reason, local integration is often not viable. Resettlement remains a lifeline for many LGBTQI+ people in forced displacement to achieve access to basic human rights.
Can you wrap it out, please? Time is out.
Yes, I also join fellow witnesses here today in urging Canada to adopt a comprehensive national framework for international human rights implementation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And now I would like, thank you for all the witnesses, and I would like to open the floor for question and answer, and we start with Madame Pam Demoff. You have the floor for 5 minutes, Madame Demoff.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. It's a shame we have so little time and so many people here. And Ms. Malashkuski, I'm sorry, I butchered that, but you know who I'm talking to because you're smiling. I have met with the Association for Prevention of Torture twice. And the first time I met with them, one of the challenges with Canada signing this is that our whole system is we have provinces and the federal government. And many of the places where people are detained are actually provincial in nature, like police stations and it doesn't mean we can't do it. Australia, Brazil, Austria, but the vast majority of countries who've ratified this, don't have our system. I know you and Dr. Zinger wrote a letter. Thank you for that. I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, what are your thoughts on Canada signing OPCAT and then figuring everything out and ratifying it later? Because we haven't even signed on to it yet. I think signing it would send a strong message. I'm speaking personally, not as the government right now. But also, if you have any thoughts on how we would deal with this division of powers between the feds and the provinces, and quite frankly, in making sure that Indigenous organizations are also involved.
Thank you very much for the question, and it sounds like I'm really pleased to know that you're as abreast as you are of these issues and that you've been meeting with the APT. Certainly, and national preventative mechanisms take different forms around the world. Many of them are sort of multi-party structures that are designed to ensure that they address the unique challenges, including at the subnational level. So for us, perhaps in provinces and territories or in spaces in which there are Indigenous governance. So I think the key really from our perspective is that we engage with the experts. So that means both the Association for the Prevention of Torture, absolutely, but also the subcommittee who is, who are themselves experts. They're the ones who do the country visits, and they've made themselves available to Canada to provide guidance. So I think that's really important, as is engaging with civil society organizations, many of whom are with us today, and to draw inspiration from some of the proposals that they have recommended. Certainly, federal states across the world have ratified OPCAT and successfully, established NPMs. So I think we're confident that working together, we can find a made-in-Canada solution to this. And certainly, I want to echo and really emphasize, should Canada sign on? Yes, absolutely. Does that send the right message? Yes, absolutely. And I think, it's incredibly important that we do this without delay and that we continue to engage with the provincial and territorial counterparts, with Indigenous representatives, to make sure that we do this in a way that will address the issues across the country. And yes, that'll be complex, but it needs to be done, and it should be done. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to cede the rest of my time to Ms. Vandenbeld.
Yes, thank you so much. And I know I'm short on time. I wish we had more time with all of you, but I'd like to direct my question to Alex Neve. It's nice to see you again. And in addition to OPCAT, or I think you were gonna speak on that. You mentioned that there's only 70% of human rights instruments Canada has signed. What are the low-hanging fruit? Are there particular instruments that you think Canada could actually sign soon, and which ones would they be?
Thank you very much for the question, Ms. Vandenbelt. I did want to add one further point on OPCAT, which is I very much appreciate Ms. Damoff's question, but unfortunately, as a matter of international law, it's not open to Canada anymore just to sign and ratify later because OPCAT is already entered into force. And the option of signing and ratifying later as a matter of international law is only a possibility before a treaty has entered into force. With respect to other instruments to ratify, the other major ones, and they're all very crucial, are the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers, obviously a very pressing issue both domestically and globally. The Convention on Enforced Disappearances, which I would really highlight, is something we should be thinking about very closely. I'm sure subcommittee members are aware of the fact that the interlocutor on residential schools has recently issued her final report drawing attention to the fact that the situation with residential schools constitutes an ongoing concern with respect to enforced disappearances, thus the need to ratify that convention. And the
Please
other
wrap it up. Time is out.
The other two are both, I would say, very low-hanging fruit because they're simply procedural instruments under the Economic, Social, Cultural Rights Covenant and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, allowing individual complaints of rights violations to be brought to the UN.
I would like to invite Mr. Lake for 3 minutes, please. You have the floor.
3 minutes or 5?
5 minutes, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First of all, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us. Obviously, a group of people who care a lot about the rights of vulnerable people in Canada, and so I appreciate you taking the time. One, observation I would make is that we do have 25 to 30 standing committees in the House of Commons that deal with the exact things that all of you are talking about domestically, and hopefully you take the opportunity to reach out to members on those committees and weigh in on whatever topic they're discussing at any point in time. There will be an opportunity for a rights-based conversation to be a part of that broader discussion. Ms. Malashewski, I'm going to go to you first, if I could. I, as some know, and maybe you don't, I have a son with autism, and I do a lot of work. He's 29 years old. We're looking at housing challenges around this and having many conversations around housing. And you brought up institutionalization. And when we get into that conversation, it's very complicated, right? People have different ideas of what that looks like and different ideas of where we ought to go. And in many cases, families are really looking for help. We've seen families who couldn't find resources anywhere and options anywhere other than dropping their loved one off at a hospital in some cases or a seniors center in some cases because there's nowhere else to turn. Can you maybe expand a little bit more on institutionalization, what your organization sees as wrong for clarity, and what a good housing environment or option might look like for people with disabilities in Canada?
Well, thank you so much for the question. And it's an area actually that's been of particular importance to the Commission as we've done some work on the intersection between housing and disability. So we actually just recently launched, and we'll have some more of the data coming out on December 3rd, which is a framework for monitoring the rights of persons with disability in housing. So specifically trying to look at what their experiences are. And certainly people being institutionalized is something that's been coming up. People being put into places, as you mentioned, perhaps it's a hospital, perhaps it's a senior's home, but somewhere that is providing services they need, but it's not actually the solution in the community that would be best for their needs. And so I think what the Commission's position is, and certainly as it relates to the optional protocol, is that in some of these instances, some of these people are ending up in facilities where there is no line of sight. There is no oversight mechanism. And so, unfortunately, when people do have to make the difficult decision or are forced into some of these institutions, and then there are abuses, those abuses are not always known at the time. And what we really need is a preventative mechanism so that we have a line of sight to ensure that as a whole across the country, we have our sight on that. But I really would encourage you, and I'd be happy to share more with your office about our work on monitoring the right of housing for people with disabilities. But certainly institutionalization is a big piece of it, but it goes even beyond that in terms of the really concerning intersections we're seeing in terms of the inadequate housing for people with disabilities across the country.
Ms. Biss, you brought up housing. Obviously, you work on housing, but when you brought up different conventions, I don't think I heard you mention CRPD. Is this something that your organization is focused on as well?
Yes, it absolutely is. And thank you for bringing up that intersection as well. The reason I didn't bring up CRPD is only because we haven't had a review for the last couple of years under CRPD. I think that one is coming up in the near future, though, so you'll see some more work on that, certainly. And I will, just to amplify as well what Charlotte Ann is saying, much of our work has to do with the human right to housing, the federal housing advocate, who was deeply involved in the work that Charlotte Ann is speaking to in terms of the mechanism around disability and the right to housing.
I have a few seconds left, so I'm actually going to use the opportunity to highlight an organization that I think is doing really important work in this area. I've had the chance to tour with Community Living Toronto, so part of the Inclusion Canada network. I'm Brad Saunders, and I just want to use, because I don't have time to really ask you a question, but if you get a chance, get him to give you a tour in Toronto. This environment, and again, a challenge to get this for everybody, but an environment where you have high-rise buildings with, 2 or 3 people in one unit on one floor and maybe another 3 people in another unit on another floor with proper supports, living in an environment with people, just Canadians of all stripes and backgrounds and experiences, living in the same building, sharing life together in an inclusive environment. I think that's probably what we're shooting for target-wise, but it's really tough when we're dealing with the housing crisis that we're dealing with right now in Canada. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Laird. Perfect timing. Et maintenant, j'invite Mr. Alexis Brunel.
I would now invite Mr. Alexis Brunel-Duceppe to speak for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 5 minutes is very short, so I'll immediately put a question to Mr. Neve. Professor Neve, you're known as somebody who says that Canadian federalism is what, in your view, the greatest obstacle to the effective implementation of Canada's international human rights obligations. To what extent can Canada be considered credible if the majority of territories dealing with health, education, housing, and other issues provincially? To what extent can Canada's credibility be maintained if these areas, territories, have no obligation to be accountable?
Is on mute.
Yeah. Mute yourself, please. Unmute yourself.
Oui. Commencez depuis le début.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour la question. And I
Thank you for the question.
That question of credibility is absolutely vital here, because I think when we highlight the failure, and whether it's a failure because of the complexities, which are not insurmountable, but are a complexity posed by federalism, or whether it's more widely the fact that unfortunately governments across the country, when it comes especially to economic, social, and cultural rights, still have a reticence to truly recognize and embrace them as legally enforceable rights. The credibility concern is that we're seeing, therefore, a failure to address very important, vitally important human rights issues at ground level across Canada. But we're also seeing a weakening of Canada's voice on the world stage, because our diplomats, our civil society representatives want to be pressing other governments to do much more to live up to their international human rights obligations, often in countries, obviously, with much more serious serious and pressing human rights concerns. But if we're not taking those obligations seriously, if we're not putting mechanisms in place to make sure that we get the work done, then what right do we have to be pointing the finger and offering advice to those other countries? So yes, a credibility gap.
C'est une conversation très intéressante, Monsieur Nive.
It's a very interesting conversation, Mr. Neve. I'm sorry. I have only 5 minutes. I apologize to the other witnesses, but I want to focus on this. This isn't the first time we're talking. In 2010, this subcommittee studied the question and concluded that an implementation mechanism was necessary to mitigate the problem. In 2017, we came up with a senior officials committee, and that hasn't done very well. So what is the solution? We talked in 2010, now we're coming up to 2021, still talking about the same thing. We did put in place a mechanism in 2017, and we're still asking ourselves today why it isn't working. So what's the answer?
Because it absolutely needs to be backed up with something that gives the force of law to these committees and these promises and these aspirations to better coordinate. You're quite right. This subcommittee highlighted this concern in 2010. It would be a long list to highlight all of the UN bodies that have stressed how much of a concern that is. The Senate Committee on Human Rights has also highlighted this, and of course, civil society groups and Indigenous peoples organizations have. I think that's why you've heard the unified recommendation from all of us for the federal government to work with provincial and territorial governments, Indigenous peoples organizations, civil society groups to develop that national framework for international human rights implementation, backed up by law, well-resourced, grounded in strong consultation and engagement processes. That's the way forward.
Merci, Monsieur Nive.
Thank you. Ms. Malashevsky, if I may. And I think it has been said that Quebec might serve as an example to the other provinces and territories. Do you agree with that, first of all? And secondly, if other provinces and territories applied the same and did what Quebec is doing, we would better respect human rights. There would be greater compliance. Yes, the fact of having that recognition as a province is very important and does serve as a model for the rest of the country. One of the difficulties we have federally is the fact that there are differences among provinces and territories. And as Mr. Neve said, the fact that is that we have many conversations, but those conversations aren't always practical and not always effective because in the end we don't have measures that ensure desired progress is actually achieved. It doesn't, or isn't, I should say, often backed by a force of law. What's really important today, well, today you heard other members of civil society here underscore the importance of having a national structure. For treaties and reviews that apply internationally. Of course, there are lessons to be drawn from Quebec, and I hope that we can continue this conversation. Thank you for the question. Thank you. If Quebec were a country, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be ahead of Canada.
I invite Mr. Jones to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
I'll start with Mr. Neve. Mr. Neve, you talked about the National Framework for International Human Rights Implementation. Can you talk about, or maybe elaborate on what that would entail and what components would be necessary to make such a framework successful?
Thank you. I very much appreciate the question, given that that's, I think, something that all of us have endorsed and see as the way forward. Certainly, it needs to be developed jointly with the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, but also with significant engagement with civil society groups, Indigenous peoples organizations, and human rights commissions across the country. First and foremost, we need to hear from all governments, and I think Alexi White highlighted how we don't hear this from the provincial and territorial governments, clear recognition of and a commitment to their international human rights obligations. Secondly, there are a number of existing bodies and strategies and policies that can be improved and strengthened, so some work needs to be done in that area. Third, we need law. This is clearly after 20 plus years of working in this space, it's evident to many of us, certainly to me, that simply relying on aspirations and promises and the development of committees is not going to take us where we need to. At all levels of government, we need what you might call a Human Rights Implementation Act. We need much improved consultation processes. We need recognition of the role that both municipal governments and Indigenous governments can and should be playing in this space. And then lastly, we need much improved resourcing, including resourcing that will support the important work of civil society in this space.
You talked also about our failure to live up to our obligations and fulfill our, the UN recommendations, which undermines our credibility in pushing other governments to do the same. Do you believe there's foreign policy implications arising from Canada's ineffective domestic approach to international human rights implementation?
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important that this committee in particular is taking up this issue, because, of course, you are a committee that's concerned about the state of international human rights around the world, which I think we would all agree is dismal and in many respects has been deteriorating and is in crisis in many corners of our world. The UN struggles to play the role that it is entrusted with in terms of safeguarding and promoting human rights. It faces contempt and disregard from numerous governments all the time. Canada needs to be a champion in that space, pressing those governments to live up to their obligations to comply with recommendations coming out of the UPR and other international reviews. But if we don't even have a decent process in place ourselves for doing so, what is the force, what is the credibility of our voice in pressing those other governments to do so?
Thank you for that. Ms. Doherty, you mentioned that you've been involved in the Universal Periodic Review process in, I think you said 50 countries. Can you provide any examples of countries that are effectively engaging with civil society in this process? Maybe what are they doing right that Canada could implement? And lastly, maybe you can identify some countries that have dedicated human rights ministers.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. And I just want to address very briefly in terms of Canada's foreign policy. Canada is running for a seat at the UN Human Rights Council in 2028. And so Canada's record in this area will be coming under intense scrutiny. So just to put that on the table and is part of the reason why we feel there's such urgency to address these issues. In terms of civil society participation in other countries, I can say from my experience, my first UPR was in Ireland, where I was fortunate enough to work with a broad coalition of organizations for Ireland's first UPR. And that process involved multiple engagements with the government over the whole cycle of the UPR. So well before the national report was written, there was a clustered engagement around thematic issues. There was resourcing for civil society. There was not only a report back in terms of what we heard, there was actual engagement and dialogue in sort of discussing what are the challenges that the government is facing in terms of implementation and what is the lived experience of people subject to human rights violation. And I think some of the other examples from other countries we can see in Paraguay, they have this publicly available database of all the recommendations that Paraguay has received, not only from the UPR, but from different treaty bodies. And there's a publicly available database where you can see where different recommendations have been implemented, and civil society can also contribute to that. In terms of...
Can you wrap it out, please? Time is out.
In terms of ministers for human rights, we see in the UK there's a Minister of State for Human Rights. In Brazil, there is a Minister of Human Rights. In Pakistan, there is a Ministry of Human Rights. It's not an unusual facet of government to have a Minister for Human Rights, and it's usually attached to either a high level, either a prime ministerial level, or at a higher level attached to cabinet level officials. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very much. I would like to thank all the witnesses for your presence with us here today. It is an important role that you enlight this committee. Your testimony, your participation in this debate is extremely important. Sorry about the time. Time is running out. We would like to continue and to have more time with you, but unfortunately we can't. I will suspend for a couple of seconds, please. Yes. We start our meeting. Monsieur.
You have the floor, Mr. Brunel-Duceppe.
So, Miss, point of order. Yes. I think that we generally don't do committee business in public, but I think that you'll find that there is a consensus in the room. So I would just suggest that everybody with a nod of heads consent, and then we can adjourn.
Okay. So, carried. Anyone? Okay. Thank you. Merci. Merci à vous tous, les interprètes.
Thank you all. Thank you to all staff and to interpreters. Thank you.